that moment changed everything. And I realized that design was a mechanism to scale great outcomes. And that's how I've always viewed it. A couple of years later, as I started going into that world and allowing myself to be exposed more to that, but when I stumbled across this thing about, oh, there's this notion of empathy, there's a way to scale even empathy, and the main thing you have to have is a mindset that says, when I look at something, is there a better way to do it?
Leading and scaling a business isn't hard because you lack ideas. It's hard because your time, your team's time, and your focus get eaten alive by the daily grind. Too many leaders are overwhelmed, under pressure, and bogged down by low-leverage tasks. I've learned this the hard way, scaling Nobody Studios, advising fast-growing startups and Fortune 500s, all while leading multiple ventures at once. I've seen firsthand how even the best executives get buried in meetings, lose strategic visibility, and burn out just trying to keep up. That's why I built the AI Executive Coaching Program, the same frameworks and tools that I've used in my own work to make it more meaningful, better leveraged, and more impactful. We're helping leaders in global businesses get hours back every week, turning chaos into clarity and operating with more leverage than ever before. This isn't theory. This is about identifying the traits you need to unlearn, the tasks pivotal to your success, and the tools that can be built into workflows to optimize your capabilities every day. From transforming meeting scripts into transcripts, into action plans, and spotting performance patterns you can't see on your own, we're upgrading the way executives lead. If you want to scale without losing your edge, let's talk. You'd be surprised how quickly you can lead at a whole new level.
Enjoying the podcast? Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on YouTube. This way, you won't miss any episode, and it greatly supports our podcast.
Today in the Unlearn podcast, we're joined by a leader who's proven that transformation doesn't have to feel impossible. It can be designed. Phil Gilbert is best known for leading one of the boldest cultural reinventions in corporate history at IBM, where he built a global movement around human-centered design. His work didn't just reshape how IBM built products, it changed how 400,000 people thought, collaborated, and led. Now in his new book, Irresistible Change, a blueprint for earning buy-in and breakout success, Phil distills those lessons into something every leader can use. A practical guide for creating momentum, not resistance, when driving transformation. We talk about what most leaders get wrong about change, why empathy isn't soft but strategic, and how to turn your organizational antibodies into your greatest allies. So if you've ever tried to change something that refused to budge, this is the episode for you. Let's unlearn and change for what really works with Phil.
We're introduced by the wonderful Bill Higgins. I actually met Bill, would you believe, in an orchard in Northern California at one of the O'Reilly food camps, where you sort of go off camping for a weekend with all these super cool people. And because my second name is O'Reilly, everyone kept coming up to me going like, are you Tim's son? Even some of his cousins who were there were like, I never saw you at any of the family barbecues. And I was like, well, that's because I'm technically not part of your family. But anyway. Right. But, you know, one of the shared things you and Bill have is a really stellar career working at IBM and just helping people really embrace new ways of working, new philosophies. You know, you led this massive change to bring design thinking into IBM, I think, which is really a seminal piece of work, I think, that probably congratulations on doing. And then you've written this fantastic book, Irresistible Change. So many people will probably be looking at you going, wow, you know, like, how has Phil gone on this journey? But what I'd love to ask you to start is maybe for yourself, if you think back, was there a moment, maybe even earlier in your career, where it didn't mean a whole lot at the time, but in retrospect, you were like, you know what, no, this really shaped what I ended up doing, not only for, you know, momentary after that, but for many years and even right up to today, that sort of strikes you as a turning point?
Sure. And actually, it's one of those things that I did know it at the time. I had been struggling with my first startup. I did my first startup before they were called startups, before I knew anything about like venture capital, stuff like that. Back in the early 80s, I got very inspired by what was happening around the personal computer, what became industry, which certainly wasn't an industry at the time. But my first startup in the late 80s, we'd kind of stalled at about 30 or 35 people. And, you know, I was, during the day, I was the founder, I was the CEO, I was out selling. And at the time, it was very difficult to get, our mission was to get more computers on the desktops of professionals. I saw the impact that these machines were going to have on decision making. And so I wanted to get them in the hands of decision makers. And at the time, it was not only hard, you were almost shamed at the office if you were a professional or an executive and you had one of these things on your desk. So you had to overcome a lot. So in the days I would go out and sell and hear the feedback and see the people out in the field. And then at night, I would come back and help my partner and my programmers start coding. And my responsibility essentially was to do the user experience of that. Again, new modern word, I was just trying to make this stuff something that people would buy. But my focus was on that front end, that interface of where these humans who were objecting to it were giving me feedback, and I was trying to respond to that feedback. And the rest of the programming team was primarily focused on the back end, again, using today's terms. Well, I just kind of thought that was the way it was, that, you know, if you're a founder, salesperson, executive, coder, you spent your days in the field, you spent your nights, you know, till 2 a.m., you know, programming. I stumbled across, we were doing a lot of work with Microsoft, and we were asked to be involved in helping envision what would become Visual Basic. And that started by it was a forms package that was bought by Bill from Alan Cooper's company. And Alan Cooper was doing some of the very first work in persona-driven design of software.
Yeah.
And my head exploded. It was like, oh my God, this is design. And there is a formalism to this, and there's a history to this. And I can lean on those professionals. That's what I was doing. I was, you know, an idiot doing it. And so it was like that moment changed everything. And I, from that moment forward, realized that design was a mechanism to scale great outcomes. And that's how I've always viewed it. A couple of years later, as I started going into that world and allowing myself to be exposed more to that, I then stumbled across the work that David Kelly was doing at the founding days of IDEO. And that later became called design thinking. But when I stumbled across this thing about, oh, there's this notion of empathy, there's a way to scale even empathy. And the main thing you have to have is a mindset that says, when I look at something, is there a better way to do it? And you have permission to do it. And again, this was a revelation to me, both professionally and personally. And so I came up with this mantra called every day is a prototype. And anybody who's ever worked around me since 1990, probably 4, has heard me say, everything is a prototype and every day is a prototype. And you have permission to change if you want to change. And that formed my worldview, both in terms of, you know, my personal life to some degree, but also certainly my professional life. And so as I ended up selling that company, and startup number 2, we really pushed the notion of design and design thinking in our products. And then startup number 3, which is what got bought by IBM, we really took it to the extreme, and we designed every function in the company to be design thinkers with respect to their function and having them identify their users who may be internal or external. That set of work is really what informed everything that we did at IBM.
So what I love about what you're sharing is these moments where you're sort of in a very opportune situation, and yet you're able to recognize that it's like a shift of some description, whether it's early days of computing. And I love that you shared this example that people were sort of ostracized for using computers in work. I wouldn't need everybody to hear that, because I think they forget these things sometimes.
That's right.
You know, right through to, you know, being around these people like Alan Cooper, Dave Kelly, all these great people who, again, they're like sort of figuring out these fields before they're called what we know them today. And, you know, you're able to identify that. So what are some of the sort of signs, if you will, that you look for? Or is it an intuition? Have you been able to sort of turn that into a mechanism that you can help other people recognize? Like what have been some of the things where you can just sense that there is a change about to happen?
That's a great question. And I guess I would have kind of, and I haven't really thought about that specific question, but what comes to mind are kind of two prongs. One is just this notion of, I feel like these words every day is a prototype. That codified something that to me, for those words, before I thought of those words, it was an intuition. I just, if you're open-minded, I have this other phrase of we need to always have a healthy disdain for the status quo. And I feel like I've always tried to embody that, of being receptive to things. And so that's number one. But number two, over the years, I have put together a bit of a formula for how we change outcomes. I write about it in the book, how I kind of came to the specific formula. But I'm a huge believer, it's not anything new to say that culture drives outcomes more than anything else. The old culture eats strategy for breakfast, however you want to say it. What we don't often do is think about, okay, what are the levers of culture? And I have come up with a formula as I've thought about how archaeologists basically how do we unpack cultures of the past? How do we come to understand them? And I kind of simplified it down to their three fundamental attributes of cultures. One is the people and their mindsets and their skills, their stature, their height, their dimension, all of the people. The second one are their practices. What are the formalized tools and practices around them that they use or that they develop? And the third thing is their places. What are their habitats? What are their work environments like? Those three things, I feel like, form a culture. And if you want to change outcomes, therefore, you have to change a little bit of all three. And so the second part answer to your question is, over the years, I have more consciously, when I've been in situations, I've tried to step back and think about who are the people that I'm with as a set of skills. Are there interdisciplinary skills in the room? Are there not? What's missing from the room? I try to be more intentional about what are the tools that we're using. Are the tools contributing to what we're trying to get done, or are they distracting from what we're trying to get done? Are there better tools? And finally, where are we? We're talking over this medium. What is this medium doing to this conversation that is different from what we may want to achieve in this conversation? Or vice versa, how is it contributing to the outcome? So I've tried to be much more intentional about the application of this formula in thinking about situations that I'm in. And that allows me to kind of, in a sense, more intentionally sense make, especially around the tools in today's era where AI is coming in. Where is AI distracting us actually? Where are the mandates for everybody to write emails with, where is that distracting us? But also, where can AI right now in this situation, how could it contribute to a better outcome? Should we be using it somewhere in this workflow or whatever? So I've tried to become much more intentional about that receptiveness by using that little formula.
Yeah, no, it sounds great. I always think this ability to suspend disbelief is one of the hardest things for most people to get their head around, right? Like we're programmed around routine, around comfort, around what we know. And it is sort of, a reflex to sort of go to that, especially in the face of uncertainty when things are new. So how have you practiced it then? Because this is one thing I'd love, what people naturally do. One of the first people we ever had on this show was a guy called Kent Beck, who created this idea of extreme programming and writing tests and code. And, one of the favorite things he ever said to me was, whenever somebody tells me an idea that I disagree with, that I think is never going to work, the first thing I go and do is try it just to see what happens, And I love that philosophy. And I feel like you've got a sense of that about you. So how have you helped yourself not to do the reflex of just closing things down, keeping yourself open to new information? Because this is a key part, I guess, of of creating change, right? Like people have to be curious and open to contrary, if you will, thinking.
My default, when I get in a situation where we're trying to come up with, we're struggling with a decision or trying to come up with some solution, my default is to take the anti-case, whatever the anti-case is. Almost as you've just said. If I can figure out, like, and you can use it to any extreme, such and such policy is a bad policy. Well, what if it's a good policy? What would that mean if it was implemented? And how could you implement it better? Today we're in the middle of a big discussion about tariffs, right, in the US. Agree or disagree with the macroeconomic impact of tariffs. But let's say tariffs are going to be implemented. How could you do it so that the outcomes that you intend for the tariffs to achieve to potentially be achieved? And I'd argue the way that we're doing it is not right. We should be starting with a few companies that actually are exhibiting the traits that the pro-tariff argument wants to promote. And what's happening too often today is that the actual implementation is hurting the companies that actually are just showing up with the attributes that we want to actually promote. So the implementation is wrong. The actual policy may be wrong too, but if you don't get the implementation right, you're not going to get it right at all. So I try to do that as much as possible, to try to intentionally kind of think about whether if I think something's bad, okay, let's actually adopt that position and try to work it through. Or if somebody comes up with some argument for the status quo, well, what if we completely turn that on its ear? What would that look like? And game that out. So I try to consciously do that. I'll give you one other tactic, though, that I try to consciously do, which I started doing a few years ago in a different context. It was in the context of actual trying to figure out how homogenous or not homogenous my teams were. I started journaling. I started doing a very small note-taking in every meeting I sit in on. And I take notes about those three things now: people, practices, and places. And I just jot down a note of who's in the room, what are their skills, what are the tools that we're using, and where are we? And I just write it down. And it just makes, it forces an intentionality on me to actually then think about the contra case. What if other people were in the room? Would we be coming to a different conclusion? Would there be different opinions put in place, put forth, et cetera, et cetera? So journaling, very lightweight journaling, just people, practices, and places. And that's helped me a lot to just stay kind of intentionally curious, if you will.
Yeah, no, it's super important. And I think the idea of writing things down is always interesting because it does focus your mind to just say, right, let me just synthesize this information that's around me here right now. And this idea, as you say, of like culture leading to outcomes, like that's ultimately a way of you asking that question of yourself. Is there something here? Like, should we be in all together in a meeting room doing this? Could we be doing it remotely? Could we have the right people in the room to make these types of decisions? It's always great things to ask, and I think sometimes people don't prepare going into sessions thinking like that. And then they're sort of sometimes stuck in the situation, realizing the outcome's probably not going to be what they want. And yet they have to sort of persist through it because they haven't had the intentionality to create the space that they wanted in the beginning. I've certainly been there a few times where I'm just like, these are the wrong people to be in this room to make these decisions. And if they make a decision that ultimately might be superseded by a manager or somebody else, they're going to feel so disenfranchised that they're going to be like, why did I invest my time in whatever we did just to be sort of closed down, right? Which again is probably the antithesis of what you want to be creating in these movements that you're trying to create around change.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So one of the chapters, which again, I always love this. When I'm reading a book and I'm like looking at a chapter, I'm like, oh, this is a cool chapter. And then I like meet the author and go, is there one chapter you'd like to talk about? And they go, actually, this chapter that I've suddenly been reading. I'm just like, yes, I love it. Right? Because
Yep.
that's what makes it fun. Um, but this is a great, the chapter sort of we're talking about is this idea of designing the leadership team. And what I really like about this is it sort of follows on just from the conversation we were having about really being intentional about, what is the makeup of the team that you're going to put in place to drive the change. And, all great examples in the world either come from history or biology, and you went for biology on this one. So
Yep.
why don't you talk us through, your thinking on this, and help people understand how you landed on this metaphor.
Yeah. When I was first asked to lead this massive effort of how do we bring these new practices, and I had done it with a very small part of IBM, with about 1,200 people over about a year and a half. And that story became known to our then new CEO, Jenny Rometty. And she said, whatever you can do there, whatever you did there, can you do it everywhere? And that was really the first provocation of, okay, we got to do this everywhere. One of the first things I did was I went around to many of our clients, because IBM has clients, all the big companies all around the world. I went to about a dozen clients, many of whom had great design legacies and programs, and many of which were not known for great design, but I knew that they had some good designers. And I went and interviewed the design teams, and it was real interesting because across all of these companies, I noticed that you could take the design teams from name your great design company, whoever you admire, and you could take their design team with the design team of some company that you would say, oh, that's a crap design company. And I'll tell you, you could not tell the difference between the designers. But what was different were all the non-designers at those companies and how they spoke about their design teams and about their design outcomes. And that's when I really realized, wait, this is not about introducing design thinking as a practice to a few people or even bringing in 1,000 or 2,000 designers. This was about 400,000 people. I need to move the mindset of 400,000 people. And none of these people reported to me, right? And so I really realized, that's when I started understanding that in order for this thing to work, people had to want it to work. And the design and design thinking part of my remit was so small compared to all of the systems and processes and people that were surrounding this little nugget of stuff that were reinforcing the old world. You have a company the size of IBM, you have got systems all around the world, and they are built, by the way, consistency is not a bad thing. In fact, the only way companies scale is through a consistent application of processes and practices. Consistency is a great thing, right up until the second that it's not a great thing. And then it's a horrible thing. So it came to me that I needed to start thinking about, I needed to build a design thinking delivery mechanism that would engage our teams as we could engage them. But there are thousands of teams at IBM, and on day 1 and day 10 and day 100, I wasn't going to get to the majority of the IBM teams. It was going to take some time just to get to them. And so I had to do two things with this little nugget of work effort that was being done at the team level. And number one is I had to put a protective shell around them. But as I started thinking about that, it hit me that what I was really talking about was I not only needed to put a protective shell around them, but I needed to give them some interface into the scaled parts of the businesses. Because in order for this thing to succeed long term, I had to change HR systems. I had to bring in new tools that affected the CIO's office. I had to create new management reports that came from the CFO's office. I needed to create what I ultimately, the mental model, were the proton spikes of a COVID-like virus. And so that's how I built my leadership team. I had a set of leaders, only 2 of which were experts in design and design thinking, but 4 or 5 of which were experts in HR, in finance, in tooling, and was the interface to the CIO. And those people Their responsibility was to engage with the scaled out part of the company and to help push the changes that we were hearing from on the ground with our early teams into the big HR systems, into the big tooling decisions, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's when this metaphor of build your leadership team like a virus. It's a metaphor, but it was literally how I built my leadership team. And I think virtually every transformation effort I've ever been involved with has got that wrong. They make the headline practice and they make the headline practice leader the head of the transformation effort. When in fact, my job as the leader of the transformation was only 10 or 20% the headline practice. And it was easily 80% the interface with the larger organization over time to sustain the momentum of the program, to help the relationship building with the scaled out parts of the business. Because ultimately, we had to change every single function in IBM's career ladder, from date of hire through, senior vice president. The career ladders had to now reflect what is the impact of design thinking and agile on this person in marketing, because there is an impact. They have to embrace this. And so we have to now codify that into the HR systems. We had to bring in new tooling that reinforced our ability to work on interdisciplinary teams in a very transparent way. That meant we had to develop relationships with the CIO office. We had to get exceptions to use non-hardened tools at the beginning to test them out. And only when they became proof points of success, then we would go in or engage with our procurement people to get site licenses, things like that. And that became a very different structure from virtually every transformation office I've ever seen. And I think it's probably one of the key contributors to our success were these relationships with the existing scaled out parts of the business and keeping them involved in the transformative parts of the business. And it was very much a give and take over time.
It was great. I was reading the chapter, and it was one of the things that really struck me is where you were talking about too much in these transformations, people lead with the process, and really what people care about are outcome and dates. And it made me laugh and smile at the same time, because that's what really matters. Like, no one cares if you're flipping pancakes to get this thing done. Is stuff getting better? And and are you hitting the dates? I just loved the candor and conciseness about what you were saying. But it also reminded me, I remember I worked in a consultancy called ThoughtWorks. And when I joined it, it was like engineering culture to the tilt. Like, everybody there was an engineer. I remember my first day, this guy, Jim Weber, who was sort of a pioneer of APIs and graph databases. There was no offices in ThoughtWorks. It was just tables. You sat down. You could be sitting beside the CEO, or you could be sitting beside Jim Weber, as I was. And he goes to me, what do you do? And I'm like, well, and ThoughtWorks only had project managers, engineers, and testers. So I fell into the project manager category, even though I have, ask anyone, my project management skills, pretty sucky. But that's what I was, that was my label. And, I remember him laughing, going, well, good luck trying to manage me, and I sat there and I was like, oh my God, this is mad, and because everybody was like, if you're not an engineer, then what are you doing here? You're a dead weight on the project because you're not writing code, and, part of what was, again, a great experience for me was like teaching people things like prototyping, or I used to get engineers to bring their code out onto the streets and show people what they were building so they would get a feedback in real time, and they hated it and then they loved it. It was quite funny.
Yeah.
But it reminds me exactly of what you're describing, right? Because, I remember when we hired designers in ThoughtWorks, and they literally sat at a table in the office for at least a month. And it's almost like people were afraid to talk to them because they didn't know what to say to them.
Right.
And
right.
It was, but again, it was the way to integrate these skills of whatever it was, design, product management, all these things that needed to come in to the team to make us multidisciplinary, to be more effective, to drive better outcomes ultimately. It was the organ donor was ready to reject, the human body part.
Yeah.
And, and it wasn't just someone going, hi, I'm the new head of design, I'm going to design everything. It really took a concerted effort of all these other functions to be curious about and almost suspending disbelief that these people weren't just an overhead to your engineering hours.
Right.
To say like, well, how's this going to help us? What if this is just the other questions, the sort of anti-question, as you were saying, what if this is going to make us go faster? What if we're going to build better software, cheaper, faster, and higher quality? And it was a transformation for the business. There's no two ways about it. So I love the way you describe that. So can you share a little bit more then, just in the minutiae then, of just a little bit of the tactical stuff that help people get started with this? Like how you've some great tips in the book about how to identify if you will, the characters to be these protein spikes, if you will, of the program team. So talk a little bit about how you identified those people and what you thought were some key characteristics that weren't about can you design.
Yeah. Good, great. Well, let's start with HR, because that was that was in many ways by far the heaviest lift. I initially, one person on my leadership team, and then a guy named Fahad Osmani, and I had worked with Fahad before, and Fahad knew the culture that I was going for. And so he was great in terms of both on the recruiting side, but also as we started thinking about what are the changes that have to happen in mindsets, if you will, of all of the non-designers at IBM. What changes are going to need to be happening? What's the as-is state and what's the to-be state from a human openness standpoint to this new thing? And Fahad knew that. Fahad's not a designer at all. In fact, he came from the consulting world, technical consulting and technical pre-sales world. But he knew this culture that I was going for. And then he had a person reporting to him, Jody Cutler, who was responsible for the tactical writing and interfacing with our global HR teams of developing career ladders. And at a company like IBM, there's not a single HR system. There's multiple HR systems around the world. That was kind of number one. So my head of talent, Fahad, knew the end state of the culture and had an understanding of what the gap was between where we were and where we needed to be, and was responsible for developing relationships with the HR team at corporate to implement the changes to our HR systems that would support all the new ways of working. This was a multi-year effort at IBM. It took us the first 2 years for most of the work, and even in year 4 and 5, we discovered some things that we needed to do to the HR systems on the engineering side that took us a couple of years to do. So that was kind of the first protein spike. Was I've got to, most transformation efforts just worry about teaching everybody agile or teaching everybody design or telling everybody to use an AI chatbot. And to me, enablement like that is completely useless, 100%.
Yeah, it's a waste of time.
Yeah. So we were working with the teams, and we can talk about what we did to onboard teams, but most transformation efforts work with the teams and get the team to deliver something better, and then they go start yelling about the outcome of that team. They don't think about all of the, when that team gets back into the real world doing the next version or the next thing, all the HR systems, none of them recognize that effort. Probably your promotion ladders don't mention the new thing. If your promotion ladders, if your ability to move from band to band to band or position to position to position isn't reinforcing the new thing, it's going to die. So that protein spike is hugely important. On the tooling side, every organization over any size at all, there's a reason that the CIO's office or whoever controls your tooling and hardens it and worries about cybersecurity and all that stuff, there's a reason for that. But it makes it very hard to bring in pilot tests of new tools.
Yeah.
So I needed to build a relationship with the CIO that was so strong that at the time she knew that if we, first of all, she allowed us to pilot things, and she knew, just because of our integrity, because of the relationship that we had built, we knew that we would keep the non-sensitive data. I'm getting very tactical here. We
It's real.
would work with the team to keep non-sensitive data off of cloud software, but we wanted to use the cloud software to see if it worked. And so we built that protein spike, that relationship building, and keeping them in the loop. Usually what happens in these things, there's a whole term for it, which is shadow IT. The business just goes around IT's back, and they use a credit card. And that actually damages you in two ways. First of all, you think you're pulling one over on them, and you might be for a short period of time, but what you're really doing is you're A, exposing your company to crazy risk, B, you're pissing off your CIO group, and most important, you're depriving them of the data that you're learning about this new tool. Because they're not your enemy. They're just trying to protect the company. So we had a very transparent relationship with our CIO that allowed us to pilot one-off technologies. And when we started to see success and multiple teams wanted to start scaling them out, we showed them the data, and we got them involved in the procurement of one-off licenses at the beginning, then site licenses ultimately. So again, that takes effort. It takes leadership. It takes time. And that protein spike is there for that. Finally, the other kind of big one I'll talk about is communications. Companies of any size have communications teams that are fantastic for getting the word out. They're also some of the most insightful people about the proclivities of their executives that they're supporting. And so if you can get them on your side, if you can learn from the global communications team and PR team, it just gives you a ton of opportunities to keep people engaged and to keep their divisions informed. And so one of the protein spikes was communications. And she was responsible for, yes, the communications of our transformation program, but more importantly, she was networking with our global communications team to keep all those people engaged and enthused. And by definition, they're going to keep their people engaged and enthused. And they're out there scouring the world for opportunities to tell your story, which is reinforcing the momentum part of transformation as well as the positive outcomes.
Yeah, no, they're all great. One that strikes me at the moment is they mentioned the shadow IT part. I feel like this is sort of having a bit of a coming out of the shadows again at the moment with all these AI tools, right? I don't think I've had anyone on the show who hasn't shared stories of their engineering team sitting, working on their sandboxed environment with laptops on their desks, like running other tools, writing code, emailing it to themselves, and then deploying it into GitHub.
Right. Right.
Like it's sort of rife at the moment, if anything, but I just think it's sage advice again that you're giving here is that, you're sort of depriving, it might feel like you're making progress in the minutia, but you are depriving the company of valuable information and opening risk. And, I've never seen shadow IT end well.
No.
Like and it's one of these things where I think even at the moment, it's a huge pressure. One of the companies I was working with are on a Microsoft stack. And when ChatGPT 5 came out, they were like, oh, I can't live in a world where I don't have GPT 5.
Right.
And even when Microsoft rolled it into their stack, people were still like, no, it's just not as good as the GPT 5 on my other, it's
don't get me started with these metrics of 30% of my code is AI written. What is it? Who cares? Like, quite frankly, why isn't it 1,000,000% of my code is written? Because the AI, it'll write code like nobody's business. I don't know why. Why'd you stop at 30? Like, if that's a metric that's important to you, have it write code. It's so silly, but I think pulling this up a level, the number one thing I'm seeing now with AI transformation efforts. And the reason I believe that the vast majority are failing, and they are failing.
Yeah, 95% apparently.
Yeah. And it's because we're back to the old butts in seat metric. We are telling individuals, go use this stuff in your individual. And quite frankly, individuals influence things, but there's not in a company of any size at all, an individual doesn't deliver an outcome to the market. It takes a team. The team is the atomic unit of change. And I don't see anybody focusing on how is AI helping the team generate the outcome that the team is working on and measuring the outcome versus the changed processes of AI at the team level. There's a lot of, like you say, there's a ton of individuals using it, effectively or not, but they're not, I don't see any difference in the outcomes in the marketplace.
Nice. No, great insight. All right. So, one last question. What are you most excited about? Obviously, completing the book is obviously the most exciting part because I know the labor that it is. But what are you hoping to see might be one sort of irresistible change that happens as a result of this?
Well, look, we're in an era where AI is important, and AI is going to be an accelerator in the same way that the internet was an accelerator, and et cetera. We are a ways off from that, I think. We have yet to have I feel like, just personal opinion, I feel like when Jeff Bezos sent that memo in, which I think was 2007, when he said everything is a service, treat all the people that use your service as customers internally, right, to build Amazon. 4 years later, we have invented an entire new paradigm of cloud computing that has been remarkably blah, 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 blah. We haven't had that moment with AI, but I think it's going to be here. And so what I'm most hopeful of is that people will take these principles that I kind of outline in my book. The team is the atomic unit of change. The outcome is what's important, and apply it to their AI transformations and actually achieve some amazing new industry as radical and as productive and as powerful as cloud computing has been as a result of having the internet incubate for a decade.
Right on. Listen, Phil, it's been great to have you on, share the stories from literally starting to convince people that they should get computers and not feel, made an outlier of the crowd.
Right.
Listen, it's been great to have you on. It's a super book, everybody. Irresistible Change by Phil Gilbert. Make sure you go grab yourself a copy. And again, thank you very much, Phil, for joining us for the show.
Barry, it's been a blast. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks so much for listening. If you found this episode useful, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please consider leaving a rating or a review, as it helps others find our podcast. For more episode and details about the show, visit barryoreilly.com, and we'll see you on the next episode.